Okay. Good evening. Welcome to the this most recent installment of Building the Scottish State with Dr. Mark McNaught. This evening we have the Craig Dalzell, the head of policy and research at the CommonWeal, and we'd like to, in the context of the COP26 climate summit, we'd like to talk about climate change and what Scotland can do in their function as a state to address climate change, and what hopefully the rest of the world could do. So first of all, thank you, Craig, for being with us this evening.
It's good to be back. Hello.
All right, excellent. So tell us what your views are on the prospects for this. There has been many people that said this is the last chance saloon for climate change. If there's not a serious agreement, then it would be very difficult to limit climate change. Or what is your view on that in terms of the current summit and what that portends for the future?
Well, look at it this way. Just before I came onto the show tonight, I was reading an article on Sky News saying that if all of the promises that have been made by the COP delegates as of right now, if all of those promises are met, and the politicians behind those delegates enact those promises, do everything that they need to do to meet those promises, and nothing goes wrong, and no one reneges to win an election, and nobody pulls out because they've thrown a political straw, and everything goes to plan, we still miss the 1.5 degrees Paris target, and the world hits 1.8 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
So if everything goes right, based on what we know right now, still everything goes wrong. COP still fails. Mm-hmm. So there's still a way to go from this conference to get to the promise of not more than 1.5 degrees. So they need to work harder.
And what does that involve? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I know that I'm not a scientist, but I respect science, so I trust what the people are telling. The scientists are telling us, but we're still continuing to dump, fossil fuel, exhaust into the air. We're not really anywhere close to being able to stopping that. Is that the only thing that needs to be done? Or because I understand also that, for example, the fact that the climate is warming. This is also, for example, in the tundra up in the north. That's melting the frozen tundra, which is also releasing methane into the atmosphere, and that's exacerbating the situation. I mean, is it just a question of stopping burning fossil fuels? What else do we need to do? I mean, if we really wanted to get a grip on this.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big danger that climate scientists have been warning about for decades, is we don't quite understand the effect we're having on the planet in terms of it's not just a linear process. It's not just if we as a species put out X amount of carbon, the world will hit Y temperature increase. There may be tipping points. There will be tipping points where we hit a certain temperature and yes, methane starts releasing out of Siberia, ice caps melt, something non-linear happens, and now instead of 2 degrees, we're now looking at 4 degrees.
Yeah.
And that's end of civilization level temperature increases.
Yeah.
So the point we really have to get across is every fraction of a degree matters. 1.8 degrees is worse than 1.5. 1.5 is worse than the 1.1 we're at right now.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to limit the damage we're doing as much as we can. But you're right, it's not just carbon emissions that we need to be talking about here. You're hearing a lot of people talk about net zero as their target. They want to be net zero in terms of carbon emissions.
What does that mean? I mean, I see that a lot. There'll be this much carbon, carbon fuels given into the atmosphere, but we'll take them out, so there'll be a net zero. I don't quite understand what that means to say net zero. Does that mean that the technology will be developed to take a certain amount of carbon out of the atmosphere to compensate the amount that we're putting in by driving cars, by burning fossil fuels. I don't quite understand. So if you could illuminate me, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what some people, especially some of the politicians, are hoping for. They're hoping for a scenario where we can more or less live the lives that we're all living right now and do the things that we're all doing right now, but there'll be some magic technology that sucks the carbon out of the air and absolves us of that sin. And that's not a solution. But nor is even the idea of just net zero, because even net zero, if the UK's target is net zero by 2050, which kind of says to me, well, okay, so another 30 years of everything getting worse before everything stops getting worse, but doesn't get any better. Throw in the fact that there's going to be a lot of countries that can't meet that timescale, that can't be net zero by 2050. The Global South, for instance, is going to struggle to reach targets like that. So if the world is going to be net zero by 2050, or whatever date we pick, then we need to look at the countries that can make that target and say, right, we might be able to meet that target, but the rest, some other part of the world is still going to be carbon positive at that point. So there's two solutions there. Either we also need to fund their Green New Deal to help them meet that 2050 target. Or we need to be carbon negative to compensate for the countries that are still carbon positive come 2050, so that the world as a whole is net zero. Preferably the solution that lies in both.
But I'm completely ignorant of all this, but does the technology exist to be carbon zero or net carbon zero? I know that we're still burning fossil fuels. I'm still driving my car, blah, blah, blah. Planes are still flying. But what is there to take carbon out of the atmosphere that's in practice right now? Or, again, what does this net zero actually mean? Is the technology actually in operation to make this happen? As far as you know, just if you could give us
this is again why I used that language of absolving us of sin. Is that there are people talking about trying to use carbon capture technology to capture the carbon coming out of oil wells or chemical plants or power stations that are burning fossil fuels. But that technology is very much in its infancy, has extremely significant barriers to be rolled out, probably can't be scaled up to anywhere near the level that we can absorb all of the carbon we're emitting at the moment, or even under reasonable projections, what we can bring those emissions down to over the next 30 years. So we can't really rely on that as a magic technology to fix things without having to change things. The folk that are really pushing that sort of carbon technology is often funded by the oil industry, by the way. They're hoping to try and do business as usual, but have a little module stuck in the end of their chimneys that makes everything okay again. No, we can't do that. We need to be reducing our emissions in the first place, rather than just trying to mop up afterwards. So, and the big danger is people who are like the UK's net zero plan that was put out a couple of weeks ago is predicated on this technology coming online at some point in the future. What if it doesn't? What if the technological barrier is too great? We get 10, 15 years down the line, the magic technology to solve things doesn't. It's now too late to fix things. So we have to stop talking about net zero, because it's not a complete solution. And it also doesn't solve things like plastic pollution or soil degradation or resource depletion, or the very fact that our consumerist economy is the root cause of a lot of this. We need to be talking about a Green New Deal, which fixes the carbon emissions problem, but also fixes a lot of the causes of that problem and a lot of the other problems in our economy that cause so many more problems in terms of inequality and insufficiency and everything else that's going wrong in our society.
And do you see? What do you see within the UK government that could work? In that sense, compared to if Scotland was independent, I mean, do you think that there's a big, a big gap to breach when it comes to what the Scotland can do as part of the UK and what an independent Scotland could do?
There's a massive gap of understanding that between what the UK is saying that it wants to do and what it needs to do.
Wow.
There's also a massive gap of understanding in what the Scottish government says it wants to do and what it needs to do. Again, they're also talking in the language of net zero. I really must reiterate, it's possible to even do net zero badly. Take, for example, a scenario where we electrify all of our cars, so there's no more emissions coming from cars, and we replace all of our gas and oil boilers in our house with electric heat pumps. But we don't properly insulate our houses, and we don't change the way we're working, so we're still all commuting to work. Then we get to a net zero future where you're still cold, you're still in fuel poverty, and you still spend most of your day in a traffic jam.
No.
That's not a good future to be in, even if it's carbon neutral.
No.
So a Green New Deal is so much more than net zero. And that's the big gap of understanding that we need to get over at both UK and Scottish level.
Yeah.
Scotland can't unilaterally do a full Green New Deal on its own, but we can do a lot to get that process started. And it's going to be a multi-decade process started anyway. So if we're talking about a government that wants to be independent within the next few years, then let's start talking about the things that we can do now, get that groundwork going, and then by the time we become independent, we can start pushing on with the rest of the Green New Deal.
Yeah. Okay. And what would that involve? A Green New Deal, and what could be done at least? Well, with Scotland as a devolved government at this point, what could they do in terms of a Green New Deal, and also what maybe they could do if they became independent? I mean, what are the limitations placed on the Scottish government being part of the UK in what the Scottish government can do in terms of implementing a Green New Deal?
Well, I'll start with the big limitation. The big limitation is finance and borrowing powers. So we can't afford to do the full Green New Deal yet. But if we plan out things, then hopefully we'll be independent by the time we do need to start paying for the stuff we can't afford under devolution. But there's to give an example of some of the quite expansive powers that we do have if we use them properly. I was writing about this on the CommonWeal newsletter this morning. So right now, the Scottish government is looking at doubling onshore wind electricity generation over the next several years. Mm-hmm. And it's got a few plans to go that. Now, I've actually laid out in my my newsletter article how Scotland could take the opportunity of this plan to actually nationalise a lot of the wind turbines. That's not a Scottish government plan, but I argue it should be. Now, I mentioned earlier that future we will all have electric heating instead of gas and oil. This is a big challenge for Scotland because right now, yes, most of our electricity is generated from renewables, but electricity only makes up a quarter of Scotland's total energy budget. Mm-hmm. Another quarter is transport, half is heating. So if we electrify all of our heating and all of our cars and we don't reduce demand, we need 4 times as much electricity generation as we do now. Quite frankly, the national grid can't handle that. Yeah. The national grid is reserved. So if Scotland goes down that path, we become stymied by the UK government there. We can only move as fast as they will let us, as fast as they are willing to upgrade the national grid. Mm. However, heat is devolved. So Scotland could start building things like district heat networks, and we could power them using off-grid wind, off-grid solar thermal panels, geothermal, a mix of other technologies. And we can build that as fast as we like. We're not constrained by the national grid at this point. Mm-hmm. We can follow some of the really exciting work that's happening in Denmark to do with their renewable heat, renewably sourced district heating systems. Yeah. So Scotland could really push ahead with that, and we could really improve a lot of folks' lives, pull a lot of people out of fuel poverty. by installing these networks, properly insulating folks' homes, properly pushing on with that. So that particular limit of devolution, the fact that electricity grids is reserved, can be circumvented if we're smart about it, if we're strategic about it, and if we forward plan.
Yeah, and what do you? I'm just sort of dipping into this because I don't really know a lot about it. But for example, building an electric car, building the battery, that requires a lot of cobalt, a lot of lithium, and other minerals. And I'm just wondering what you know about the trade-off between, yes, when you have an electric car, it doesn't give out any. It doesn't give out any, greenhouse gases, but the mineral extraction to get the minerals necessary to build a battery, for a car, which is, considerable. What do you know about the trade-off in that sense of how much it costs? What are the costs of the mineral extraction necessary to build a battery relative to the savings that it would do in terms of of emissions into the environment? I know that's a very, a complicated question, and I don't expect you to answer it accurately.
Complicated question, but it's also one that kind of goes off into that future of, net zero is not a Green New Deal. Because if what we do is replace every car on the road with an electric car, we still end up in that future where we're all stuck in traffic jams, and we do hit those resource limits of all the other materials that go into building a car. We also have the geopolitical system that results in the global north exploiting the global south to get those resources. If instead we redesign our transport network so that we simply don't need as many cars on the road, a lot of us don't travel as far. We have much more local economies. A lot of us work from home a lot more. We've already seen that happening. We encourage that. We have better public transport because a bus can fit a lot more people on it than the equivalent amount of cars, per unit resources. You can move people more efficiently using public transport. We can reduce that demand on those resources and end up in a Green New Deal future where you're either not traveling as much, or you're traveling better, and we're not putting as much strain on the planet. We're living a much more sustainable life. And that goes beyond just the carbon emissions.
No, I mean, I live in Rennes, here in France. I live just a couple hundred meters from my work, and I also teach at another university where I'm able to bicycle or take the bus to work there. But not everybody has that option. The way that especially in the United States, the way you have these massive suburbs and I know it's different in Scotland and the UK, but how do you get around that? I mean, for example, in the US, where you have these, like places like Atlanta or Houston, Texas, or Dallas, Texas, where it's just massive, and you have to have a car, to get around, or else you're not going anywhere. How do we get around that? In terms of carbon, do we need to redesign the American city? This
is why the authors of that original paper that coined the term were so smart about this, the Green New Deal. It doesn't resonate quite so much with European audiences, but especially American audiences who know how substantial a change the New Deal was to get America out of the depression of the 30s. And what was that? It was nothing less than the complete reconfiguration of the economy of a continent. And that's the scale of the changes we'll be doing. All those mega cities, all those mega suburbs can be rebuilt, can be turned into something else. We can localize those economies. It's just going to take a bit of strategic planning and then going out with the shovels and doing it. The Green New Deal isn't a science project. It's not trying to dream up a new fancy technology that will solve all of our problems. It's an engineering project. It's building things. I was recently talking to journalist Pat Kane. He was writing for his blog. He's made this bit public, so I can talk about this. And he asked me, "Is this going to be the century of scientists and engineers and tech wizards and said, no, it's going to be the century of carpenters, plumbers, and shepherds, right? Because we need thousands of kilometers of pipe for the district heating systems.
Yep.
We need a lot more wood for construction, and we need a lot of sheep wool for insulation.
Yeah.
It's about taking that existing technology and scaling it up rather than finding some new magic.
Yeah. No, and do you see? Is it realistic to see progress occurring? I mean, there's so much discord in the world. I mean, fighting between the U.S. and China, and in the U.S. and the U.K. against the EU and all that. Is it realistic? I mean, but I think there's a huge amount of people that are like, yeah, of course we want to progress on environmental issues and and make these things better. How realistic do you see real cooperation that could make a real difference? In between, not only within Scotland or the UK, but within other countries as well.
It's as realistic as we want it to be. I mean, it really just does take us, getting it done, or if the people above us don't want to do it, replacing them with people who do. In terms of the inter-country conflicts, well, if you're having to go to war over oil, then think about why you need that oil. Can you wean yourself off it? And then you don't need to go bomb another country to get theirs.
No,
it's actually quite interesting that one of the biggest emitters of carbon in the world is the U.S. military. So
I heard that. I read that they emit more carbon than certain countries. I mean, it's just insane. And and the fact that I think the U.S. is obviously the most prime target to reduce emissions. I mean, just in terms of an internal scale. And also through its military, and not having to wage war over, access to fossil fuels, that would be a really positive step. I just don't. I mean, but I teach American politics, and I just don't see that happening. Given the fact that so much of it is controlled and by multinational corporations, especially the petrochemical industry, which has a chokehold on the political system, and I'm skeptical.
Well, let me just
finish and then go ahead. I knowing how corrupt the American political system is, and how the petrochemical industry has such a chokehold over it, I don't know how progress is to be made. I hope it is, and maybe it can be, but I'm skeptical as to how it can. So anyway.
Well, we have just seen tonight in the UK just how far corrupt lobbying can take you, how far and no further. So there may be lessons for other politicians in that regard.
Okay. What was that? I didn't hear about that. So if you could explain.
So there was an MP in the House of Commons who was found to be abusing his position on behalf of lobbyists. He was pulled up and sanctioned. Boris Johnson tried, the UK government tried to avoid the sanction by tearing up the entire standards process and replacing it with a vote in the House of Commons, which of course he has a majority, so he could have rammed that through. And it's caused so much backlash, he's had to U-turn on that. So it's a bit of a political scandal going on in the UK right now over corrupt lobbying.
Yeah. Okay. I remember it was probably 20 years back at least, but I remember having a discussion between my cousin and my brother about the future of the planet. And my brother was of the opinion that, oh yes, science will save us. All these advances in science will get us through that, and we'll be able to mitigate the problems with the planet, the environmental problems. And my cousin Anina was like, no, we're humans. We've screwed everything. There's no way that we can, whatever science may be able to produce, we've screwed it up, and we're on this course to, destroying the planet. And so there was kind of polar polar opposites, but between science can save us, whereas, well, science can maybe help us, but we as humans have screwed everything up, and there's no way that we can come back from that. Where are you on that spectrum? In terms of what we can do.
Science has already invented the shovel. We need to now dig the hole. That's the state of it. We already have the technology to solve the problem. I am a techno optimist. I believe this problem can be solved. It just takes us actually doing the work. We have already caused a great deal of damage to this planet. Every fraction of a degree matters from here on in. Giving up will make it worse. Working hard will make it less worse.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we are.
What needs to happen? Okay, so we're dumping all of these, all of these fossil fuels into the atmosphere. Especially since over the past 200 years, since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, where we've been burning coal and all these other, and oil and all these things on a massive scale. We've been changing the composition of the atmosphere. And to where the globe is warming and it's having all these effects. What technology exists to reverse this, and is it even realistic to expect that we can get back to a point where there is not global warming? I mean, is that even possible in your view, based on your knowledge?
Right. So that's where I really want to bring in the CommonWeal Common Home Plan. It's the world's first fully costed, fully comprehensive roadmap for a Green New Deal for any country in the world. Mm-hmm. So we did this for Scotland in 2019. One of the big things about this is we are looking at this international conference called COP at the moment. Delegates trying to come up with these multinational treaties. The big thing that has been playing on my mind and our mind at CommonWeal over the last several years is that the carbon emissions we put out are a global problem. It doesn't matter where the carbon is emitted, it's a problem for everybody.
Of course.
But we do know where the carbon is emitted. That is a hyper-local problem. Mm-hmm. Your car exhaust, your badly insulated roof, that factory, that power station. These are things that we can deal with. So there's no excuse pointing at another country and saying you're not doing anything and using that to absolve us of not doing anything.
Yeah.
We could be doing it. We could be going through all of the different areas that the Common Home Plan covers. And I really highly encourage people to read through it. It's a big, big book, and I could literally talk for hours going through every chapter. But I've mentioned transport. I've mentioned
in a minute, if you want to just go through the major points of it, that would be good. Go ahead. Finish your major point, and then if you can get on to the major points of this study that you've conducted.
Yep. So I mentioned transport. How we have to reconfigure our transport sector not just decarbonize it, but to reduce the demand that we put on it. I mentioned energy, how we can really forge ahead with efficient heating systems and other zero carbon power sources. Housing, we really need to start building houses that are fit for the Green New Deal and retrofitting the houses that we have, filling them with sheet wool, as I mentioned, filling them with other insulation, fixing their internal heating systems to patch them into the district heating systems. Food. We need to think about what kind of food we grow, where we grow it, how we grow it. A lot of our food is built on a very extractive and linear process. You fertilize a field, you grow the food, you transport the food to a city, you eat it, and then a couple of steps happen and you flush all that nutrients out to sea. Yeah, especially in the South Coast right now. We need a circular economy in agriculture, so we need more permaculture and other agroecological methods of growing our food. We need to think about where we're getting our food from. People might have seen a very famous, sort of very viral picture of a plastic tub of pears that were grown in Argentina and packed in Thailand. We're shipping these products around the world, sometimes several times before they get to your plate. Yeah. And all the carbon emissions that go into that kind of transport, especially if it's like fresh products that you're not sending by ship, you're sending by plane. That's hugely damaging. So we need to grow more food locally as well. And grow more materials locally. You could be thinking about harvesting our the wood for our construction more locally. Scotland has a lot of Sitka spruce out there, but not a lot of it is used for construction, and certainly not enough to power the housing revolution that we have to go through. Yeah. We need to think about the consumerist capitalist economy as a whole, instead of buying throwaway things that break after one use. We need to be borrowing and loaning and swapping and sharing more. Every town should have a tool or a resource library where, instead of going out and buying a cheap power drill to do a bit of DIY and then throwing it in a drawer and forgetting about it, you just go and borrow one. Yeah. Or if you can't afford to even buy that cheap power drill, now you have access to one because you can go and borrow one. You don't buy so many power drills. The DIY tools sector shrinks dramatically, but everybody gets access to better, higher quality tools and better, higher quality goods and produce through this sort of borrowing and sharing and loaning. Again, that's a big difference between a net zero, where everything's decarbonized but still hyper consumerist, and a Green New Deal.
Yeah. Well, what have been I love tools. I have a tool collection that I inherited from my grandfather, and I love this idea. But can you give examples where, for example, a tool sharing program has been introduced that is successful? And I'm not saying it couldn't be, but how could it be introduced in Scotland? They
already exist in Scotland. You've got some really, really good ones in Edinburgh and Glasgow and other places. Again, it needs to be scaled up. We need to be thinking about these tool libraries the way we think about book libraries. Everybody should have access to one as a right.
I love that. I love that idea.
But they already exist, and they're already wildly popular.
Go ahead.
Precisely, literally do. I highly encourage people to check out the tool libraries that already exist in Scotland. I can't remember how many episodes it was ago, but on the CommonWeal Policy podcast a wee while ago, we had some folk from the tool library in Edinburgh on the show telling us about how they got started and how they work. So encourage people to check that out if they can.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And what do you how do you see things going forward in Scotland in terms of the environment? I mean, we have the COP26. As far as I can see it, like in so many other countries, everybody's still driving cars, everybody's still eating meat, everybody's, going on to a large extent how they were before. Excuse me. How do you see the fundamental change coming that would be necessary to truly, reduce carbon emissions, to bring them down to where the global heating is minimized to the real policy changes that need to be implemented? Do you see that happening, and how, if so?
One of the biggest cons that the oil industry came up with, and it literally was the oil industry that came up with it was invented by BP, is the idea of the personal carbon footprint, and the idea that personal choice will save the world. Just you choosing to eat less meat will save the world. We do need to eat less meat. That is one of the big things that will come along as part of the agricultural revolution here. But if government policy doesn't make doing the right thing cheaper than doing the wrong thing, then you're not going to make that choice. And if you can't make that choice because you're in a low-wage economy, in a precarious situation, surviving on the most meager social security in Western Europe, then you can't make that choice. That isn't a choice for you. So this is the difference between the government responsibility and personal responsibility. It only becomes personal responsibility once that choice is enabled.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And realistically, I mean, what do you see the UK government doing, the Scottish government doing? Do you see this? Do you see making meaningful change in environmental policy? Do you see that as feasible at this point? Or I'm
It's entirely feasible.
I'm skeptical myself, but how do you see it?
Entirely feasible, but neither the UK government or the Scottish government are doing enough.
Mm-hmm.
So, one, the enacted policies based on the promises that have been made, even if fulfilled, will not meet those promises. Scotland regularly misses its climate targets, and we're not clear how it's going to even catch up to them. Never mind go that extra step to meet what we actually need to do to keep things below 1.5 C. And again, both governments are still talking about net zero. They're only talking about carbon. They're not talking about fixing everything else as we go.
Yeah. And what else needs to be fixed? I mean, I know there's a lot of stuff. And if you could wave a magic wand and change everything so that the environment would be much better protection, what would you do? Again, magic wand. You can change everything. Waving it. What would you order that wand to do?
I didn't wave a magic wand. You're falling into that trap again. You're falling into that trap of a magic solution. I didn't need to wave a magic wand.
I'm not saying
I wrote a book.
But I'm saying, what realistically, if you could wave a wand, a realist wand, a rational wand that could change things. And and make and make the change that you see as necessary. What would be those changes based on this empirical wand rather than magic?
As I say, it was not a magical wand. It's a roadmap and a blueprint. So as I say, CommonWeal produced the Common Home Plan, the first fully costed comprehensive Green New Deal plan. So what would I do? Everything in that, in the order that we said we'd do it in the book. It takes us from where we are now and lays down all the steps that we need to do. How many people do we need to start training now so that in 2 or 3 years they're ready to start insulating houses?
Yeah.
Right? Where are those houses? One of the things that we really need to do now is go house by house and survey every house in Scotland, work out what its energy efficiency rating is right now, work out what it feasibly could be upgraded to, and then set up a plan to get it there. Right now, the Scottish Government's got a plan just based on the Energy Performance Certificate ratings, EPC ratings, which we've actually written a paper showing how flawed they are. But it's also putting a lot of the onus of making those upgrades onto house owners, and house owners are not in the best position to make those upgrades, especially under the plan that the Scottish Government has, which could lead to people doing things like meeting the first target by upgrading their gas boiler to a more efficient gas boiler, and then discovering later that was the wrong thing to do because now they need to rip out that new gas boiler and replace it with an air source heat pump.
Yeah.
Whereas if they had that upgrading roadmap from the start, we could plan out exactly what needs to be done so that we can minimize the disruption and the cost on these upgrades.
Yeah.
So it's about that kind of strategic planning that has to start now, setting up the roadmap, setting up the plan, and then building it over the next 20 odd years.
Yeah. And what are these heat pumps? I've seen that, because contrasting them with gas boilers or with heat pumps. What are heat pumps?
Have you ever put your hand in the back of your fridge? No, it's something everybody does every day
for some reason, but I'm not. It's not a habit anyway. But,
if you put your hand in the back of your fridge, you'll probably burn your hand. Okay. It'll certainly be warm. So a heat pump, literally, as the name suggests, it takes heat from one location and pumps it to another. In your fridge, it operates by taking the air inside your fridge and pumping the heat outside of your fridge so that the inside cools down.
Okay.
For your house, it's doing the opposite. It's taking the heat in the air outside your house and pumping it inside so that your house can heat up. And it's much more efficient than, for example, just a radiant electric coil heater.
Okay.
Coil heaters are horrifically inefficient. So it's much more efficient than that. But it's, again, there are problems with rolling out a future where everybody is individually expected to put one of these in their house, because it's not the best way of doing it. And we explain this in the Common Home Plan. Again, I really
And
hope
is this
someone can read
electrically
this.
powered? I mean,
It's electrically powered. It's electrically powered, but because you're not generating heat as you would in a coil, you're moving the heat. What happens is, for every unit of electricity that you use to run the heat pump, you can pull 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 units of energy from the outside air into your house.
Okay.
So it's much more efficient than just directly heating with a coil. But it's a much less efficient process, much less efficient system than if we go down the Danish method I mentioned of district heating, which is a collective way of heating the houses of an entire community using renewable energy or hydrogen or geothermal or whatever is available in that local area.
Okay. All right. I want to get to a few of the questions.
Yes.
Let's see. Green New Deal. We've touched on that. The common home policy. I'm not sure what.
Right. I think the name for our roadmap is the Common Home Plan.
Okay. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, as I say, I just hit some of the major topics of it. It is, once again, it's the world's first fully costed comprehensive Green New Deal for any country in the world. We have it in Scotland. We can do it. We can certainly do the first half of it with the powers that we have if we're smart about how we use them. But by the time we need the powers for the second half, well, we should be independent, shouldn't we?
The sooner the better, certainly.
Exactly.
Yeah. Does CO2 not help plants grow? Also, our food.
Right.
Let me. Just as my understanding, we emit CO2, but then it's processed through plants back into oxygen. Is that right? Or I mean.
At the sort of high school biology level, yes, plants breathe CO2 the way we breathe oxygen. And it's much more complicated than that. I'm not a biologist, so I don't want to go too much deeper into that. However, plants are very sensitive to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we are pushing that balance upwards. We're also pushing up temperatures. We're also doing things like depleting the soils. We're changing ocean acidity. We're changing the entire ecology and geology of the planet. And we're finding that a lot of plants are struggling or are going to struggle at the kind of levels of CO2 that we're projecting in the future. Certainly, there's areas of the world that are already extremely vulnerable to increasing temperatures and are starting to see crop failures. So a lot of people, especially in the global south, who, remember, did not cause this problem. It's on us. We are the emitters. The global south is starving because of it. They're starting to see crop failures and
imperialism plays a little role as well. But yeah, that's
yes,
definitely
that's also our fault. We're also we might see the grain belt of Europe move northwards as temperatures increase. What happens when that northern limit hits the ocean? And then we have a problem here too. So this is not a game that we want to play with the planet about how far we can push CO2 and still grow food.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's see. What role do permaculture and copacing play in the Think Global Act local part of Scotland's response to the climate collapse? I don't fully understand that question. Maybe you understand better than I do, but
yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the way we do agriculture is very linear and very extractive. It's pulling resources out of the ground, and a lot of the way we put it back is through fossil fuel based fertilizers. So we need agroecology is the broad term for this. It's agriculture, but in a sustainable and ecological way. Permaculture is a particular niche or style of that agroecology within that. Something I'm quite personally fascinated in, as is my partner. Don't really want to go into the details of it here because I'll talk about that for hours.
That's fine.
Coppicing as well is right now. A lot of the forestry we do in Scotland, the commercial forestry, is based on basically grow Sitka spruce and then clear it. Just clear cut the entire forest. And that's, again, not a very sustainable way of doing it. The plantations themselves are not very ecologically sound. They're essentially tree deserts. Nothing grows there except for those trees. We should be thinking about how we manage our forests in a much more sustainable way, and we harvest them in a much more sustainable way. And coppicing and pollarding and other techniques that have been used for millennia to sustainably harvest wood is part of that.
Okay. And what do you see, given what powers the Scottish Parliament has now, and then relative to the devolved, or the reserve powers of the Scottish Parliament, of the UK Parliament, if independence could be achieved soon, hopefully, what would be the most important powers in your view that could push ahead, real environmental reform within Scotland, and make it, as good as possible in terms of in terms of looking after the environment? What are the basic powers that the Scottish Parliament needs that would hopefully come about with independence that would really make a difference?
The big one is finance. The Common Home Plan that we've laid out would cost around £170 billion spent over 25 years. Now, we've costed that. If we borrowed that money, the way governments normally borrow money, and we paid that back over 50 years, and I know the modern monetary theorists are already screaming at me, just run with me for this. If we did that,
no, you just create money out of thin air like every other country does.
Yeah, and then we'd have to rebalance all of our taxes to pull that back out of the economy, and it would look almost identical to the conventional economics plan. So it would all come out in the wash. Just how you translate it would matter. But if we borrowed that money and paid it back, then it would cost Scotland about £5 billion a year to implement this Green New Deal. We've calculated that between the economic stimulus of that investment, plus the profits from the things like the nationalised energy companies and other nationalised industries that would be working to build that Green New Deal, Scotland would bring in about £6.5 billion in tax revenue every year. So this plan pays for itself, more than pays for itself. So even if climate change didn't exist, it would make sense to do this.
Yeah.
But that's the big barrier. That's the biggest barrier that Scotland has. There's trade policy as well. We obviously don't have control over trade, and the UK government's going for free trade with small faraway countries in a way that actually negatively impacts our economy.
They've given up the EU, their closest neighbors. Oh, let's have a great deal with Australia or New Zealand, which is the other side of the world.
So we should be pushing our trade policy, one, to actually limit our imports, to de-incentivize imports in favor of domestically produced goods, because we can control how those goods are produced in a much better way. So we can produce them in a sustainable and Green New Deal way, rather than relying on other countries doing it or not doing it. Probably limiting our exports for travel emissions purposes, but more importantly, using that trade policy to bring a coalition of the willing along with the Green New Deal. Finding alliances of countries that are willing to take that step before others are, and saying, right, well, we're going to harmonise our trade policies so that we encourage the trade between the countries that are doing the right thing, and we'll put externality taxes on the goods coming from elsewhere. And if they want to remove those trade tariffs, then they can come into the coalition of the willing as well.
Yeah. And into what detail have you really, laid out these policies of a Green New Deal and stuff like that? And I fully understand. I mean, when Scotland doesn't have the powers to enact these kind of things, and there's so many contingencies involved. I mean, if you actually were able to be in a position to enact these policies, there's so many things. But what basically, to what degree have you really spelled out in detail what this Green New Deal would be, and
again, I'll point people towards the book and let them judge that for themselves. However, along with the book, we have also produced well over 100 policy papers now at CommonWeal. Not all of them directly on the Green New Deal, but a huge amount of them are. So we have a vast library of papers on energy policy, for instance. That goes into, even you'll have seen the pictures of how Scotland's renewables are disadvantaged because of the way the UK national grid is set up. It costs a lot more to connect renewables in Scotland than it does to connect them in the south of England, for instance. So we've got a policy paper that has several solutions to that. We have papers, as I say, on reforming how we measure housing energy efficiency, so that we can better and more appropriately insulate and heat them. We have papers on housing construction, how we do that better. We've got papers coming out on retrofitting, because that's the biggest challenge that we face in the Green New Deal. Is actually,
there's so many older houses that are made out of stone, or tenement houses, what have you, and then how do you make them the most energy efficient? Even though they may have been built 100 years ago or more. Exactly, and actually doing that in a way that even encapsulates the full lifetime embedded energy costs of the building. So even a fairly inefficient building, then if you look at how many expected years of lifespan it might have left, it might be less efficient to tear that building down and rebuild it than it would be to just insulate it properly.
Yeah,
and there's so many other factors to take into consideration. Yes, of course, the energy efficiency, but how,
So I think the short version of your of the answer to your question is we have done as much as we can in as many areas as we can.
Sure.
If folk want to read through it and they find a gap, find somewhere that we can go further, and I'm sure there will be some, then please let us know, especially if you know someone who can help fill that gap, and we'll work on it, and we'll get that policy paper out as well.
Sure. We're beginning to wrap it up, but what does Craig think of the new Green Deal that Richard Murphy has worked on? I mean, he's the economist from London. To the extent you know about what he's proposed, let us know.
I'm good friends with Richard. Richard Murphy was one of the co-authors on that original report in 2008, 2009 that coined the term Green New Deal. He has been working on this quite extensively since then. So we have learned a lot from him. And a good chunk of our Common Home Plan was based on discussions with him. He helped advise us, and he's not to shout too much, but our own trumpets here. You know how Scots are with self-promotion, but he has said that our plan remains one of the best, the most comprehensive, most detailed plans that he's ever seen. So he's quite happy with our work, and he certainly had a hand in
Good.
making
it I've been following in the United States. I've been following Richard Wolff a lot. He's really good too. I mean, talking about he's a socialist. He one of the few in the United States, and his commentary has been very illuminating. But anyway, we won't go into that at this point. What about is hydrogen not a better way to go than electric or transport? And I know hydrogen, of course, it's, H2O, water has a huge amount of hydrogen. I don't know what is involved in, and I know that there are hydrogen engines. I don't know what is, how much energy is required to remove hydrogen from, say, water. What can you tell us about hydrogen power and its potential? Because I do know it's very clean, but maybe extracting hydrogen requires a huge amount of energy. I don't know, but just tell us what you know about hydrogen as a power.
So we have a dedicated chapter on hydrogen in the Common Home Plan. We work out how many tons of hydrogen a Green New Deal Scotland will need, and how many gigawatts it would take of electricity it would take to produce it. Hydrogen can be clean. So-called green hydrogen is produced just through electricity splitting water into hydrogen and oxygen. and then you burn it or recombine it to release that energy again. It can also be extremely dirty. Blue hydrogen is the buzzword at the moment, being touted by the oil and gas industry. It is produced by cracking methane into hydrogen and CO2. That process produces as much CO2 as just burning the methane. So this is a way that the oil industry is trying to get in on the hydrogen economy and do it in a way that allows them to look like the saviors while not actually changing their business model or their emissions in any way. Now, is it a better way to go for electric? It will depend on how the technology pans out in the end, but the best estimates we have, and we go into this in the Common Home Plan, is that hydrogen looks like a very good solution for large transport. So trucks, buses, ships could be really good for that. Not so efficient for smaller vehicles like cars. Okay. You might want electric for that. It does depend on the infrastructure you lay down as well. One advantage of electric vehicles is you can charge them at home. You don't need to have a pressurized hydrogen tank under your drive. That said, while there is a place for hydrogen in things like transport, we kind of see the main use for hydrogen is really as a replacement for coal and steel production, as a replacement for oil and gas in things like chemical productions. So things from fertilizers to organic chemistry, maybe some bioplastics or other materials that we currently make out of oil. What we absolutely shouldn't be doing is putting it into the gas network and piping it to people's homes as a replacement for natural gas. It is very ill-suited for burning it as
I mean, for example, I have a gas, water heater. Could I just replace hydrogen with it? And
no.
would it work?
Is the simple answer. No. You can blend
a
certain amount of hydrogen.
I was just curious. Yeah.
You can blend up to about 20% hydrogen into your natural gas main. That's about the limit. Go beyond that, you need a new burner so that means you need a new boiler. You probably also need to replace a lot of gas pipes because hydrogen leaks through a lot of materials in a way that natural gas doesn't. So especially if you're still in an area with iron gas mains,
hydrogen is like only one molecule, right?
Yeah. So it leaks through materials.
It leaks through. I mean, maybe I'm being simplistic, but it would leak through, joints that otherwise would be contained.
Yep. Or even worse, hydrogen can react and embrittle a lot of materials, so it can degrade the materials that it's traveling through. So there's this big gap between you start blending hydrogen into the gas network, you get to 20%. Now you need to change everybody's boiler and rip out all the gas mains and replace the entire gas network. Yeah. And you end up with a heating system that doesn't work as well as gas. And has some safety issues as well because a hydrogen flame is not easy to see; it's almost invisible. So if you're committing to that future of ripping out the entire natural gas grid and replacing it, why not replace it with a district heating system that can do the job better? Can pull in, doesn't lock you into the future price of hydrogen as a heating source, but can use other heating sources like solar thermal, like renewable electricity, or if it happens to be cheap that day, could use hydrogen. You could burn hydrogen in a district heating generator and pipe that heat into the system. So it's much more future-proof. So we could go down that hydrogen future. If we do, we'll probably end up going down the blue hydrogen future lobbied for by the oil and gas sector. Or we could actually have a Green New Deal and do things better.
Okay. All right. We'll be wrapping it up here in a minute, but it's been delightful to have you. And is there anything you'd like to say to our viewers before we sign off?
Again, I just encourage you to check out go to the website commonweal.scot. go into our policy library, find our Common Home Plan. You can get it digitally for free. You can buy a hard copy if you like. We really do appreciate it if people buy our stuff as well, because it's folk like yourselves who fund CommonWeal. We're entirely reliant on donations and merchandise purchases from our supporters. But the real lesson in all of this is we already have the tools. We just need to go out and start doing it. And we need the Scottish Government especially, but all other governments, to realise that that's the case. The solution to this global problem is on their doorsteps, on our doorsteps. We just need to go out and start doing it.
Okay. All right. On that note, thank you very much for being with us this evening. And thank you to all of our viewers for watching this evening. And we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.